Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's DEI Spotlight. I have the very distinct pleasure of featuring an outstanding attorney, community leader, and friend, Hardeep Dee Sull. If this is your first time joining, welcome. And if I could just say, my name is Kennedy Cobbin Richardson, and I am the managing partner of Kengen LLC. We are a consulting firm specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We bring in an innovative and holistic approach to developing people, teams, and culture. We are laser focused on actual behavioral change by building a groundswell of DEI champions that are influential at every level of your organization. Our customized training is evidence-based and data-driven to help people, one, acquire the essential skills to have courageous conversations. If you cannot talk about it, we can't solve anything. Secondly, acknowledge and accept the history and context of injustice in America. Again, if we can't really talk about the problem, there is really no solution. Thirdly, we have to articulate the lived experiences of marginalized groups. There are groups and places and meetings that people of color and women are not a part of, and therefore we need allies in that room to speak up when our voices are absent. And fourth, act as an ally to accelerate DEI wherever you live, work, and play. So a little bit about me. I'm a DEI consultant for multinational corporations and nonprofits. My specialties are youth development, workforce development, education, and now hospitality. I've really enjoyed my career over the last 20 years, leading nonprofit organizations, mostly for youth development and workforce development. But my passion really is removing barriers and allowing people to live their best life. And really what that means is I believe that we only have one life as far as I know. And I want people to be able to live to the full extent that they can. And that when there are barriers, my goal is to try to remove those barriers. And I've done that literally in every career, job, occupation, friendship that I have in my life. This is truly a passion. To be clear on what an ally is, so that we are focused on true and real behaviors, a person of one social identity group who provides actionable support. So this is different than an advocate. An advocate is a person who supports, believes, may do a hashtag of support on social media. But actionable support really requires an impact on people, policies, and procedures that change the systemic nature of an injustice. And this is normally the dominant group, or typically the dominant group, forming an alliance with a marginalized individual that is being discriminated against or treated unjustly. Also want to be sure that we understand the key definitions that we'll talk about today, since we are dealing with the traumatized experiences of undocumented workers. And so there are a few definitions that are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are not at all always interchangeable. So between immigrant, migrant, refugee, and immigrant with an E. So an immigrant is an individual who willingly leaves their country of origin and legally enters another country where they are granted permission to permanently resettle and work without restriction. And that I think we're most familiar with. A migrant, a person who willingly leaves home and moves from one place to another, most often in search of employment. So if you are familiar with the Great Migration of African Americans moving from the South to the North and Northeast in search of employment, mostly industrialized mills and factories, that is we would say that's the Great Migration, or they migrated from the South to the North. However, a migrant can also be international. A refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. Under US law, a refugee is someone located outside of the United States. And I can remember in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina happened, and I mean 95, when it was 2005, when Hurricane Katrina happened, and people, the news, the government, they were calling Hurricane Katrina victims refugees. And people were so upset about that because they were not from another country. They were not escaping war or natural disaster, but here, right here in Louisiana, in the United States. And so that was just disrespectful. And then finally, an immigrant with an E. Immigrant is used when talking about the person, the country a person has moved from. And so, for example, my grandmother immigrated from Germany and she is an immigrant in the United States with an I. Okay, so I hope those make sense as we continue to have this discussion. Another thing that, in order to have this discussion in an informed fashion, it is critical that you understand intersectionality. And that just looks at the dimensions of our identity that compound the effects of injustice. So, for example, someone can be discriminated against based on their race alone, right? But then if you also add being a woman on top of that, then you are doubly discriminated against as both a woman of color, but both as a woman and a person of color. Then let's add on class. You're also in poverty. And so that is another opportunity for someone to discriminate against you or treat you unjustly. So now you're a woman of color who is also poor. And then let's just go ahead and add on, you're also a lesbian. And so you can begin to see how all of those dimensions of identity can begin to compound on someone and how that can really affect the experiences of their life. And for me, it can be a weighty thing that in any situation, I'm not quite sure what we're discriminated against. Is it this or that? However, it does happen. And so in order to have this conversation, it's really important. And so with that, look at how, and so those intersections of identity also come into play in a very concrete way when we look at pay. So for example, and this is from the Brookings Gender Equality Series, for every $100 that a man makes, a woman for the same role and the same background will make $79. If you add on the intersection of being Black, they will make $64. You add on the intersection of being Latina, then it is $54. So you can see in very concrete ways the value people have based on arbitrary characteristics that none of us have any control of. I have no control over my race, my gender, my and all of these other dimensions. These are things that I was born with, but therefore are forced to deal with and reckon with as I experience and live life. Undocumented workers, the potential loss of wages and fear of deportation, compounded with a lack of formal employment terms or a contract, leave immigrant women vulnerable to various forms of abuse. Because America began with exploiting African people and making them become slaves, this country is really not. I'll put in the more positive term. This country is very familiar with the exploitation of workers, and with that, it continues not in slavery, but in very meager wages and work conditions that are, in many ways, unbearable or forced to deal with being treated and abused while at work and feeling like you cannot do anything else. And so part of our discussion with Dee Sull will be about the Sandra Perez case, where she alleged in a federal lawsuit that her manager, Zachary Sabias, raped her weekly inside a walk-in cooler at the Sbarro inside the Monte Carlo resort on the Las Vegas Strip. She said that he knew she was undocumented at the time. He hired her and other family members, including her undocumented daughter and sister, and threatened to deport them if they did not comply. I'm going to play an NBC News clip of this case so that we can all really understand some of the nuances and
This president's case is among the most horrific stories, the most horrific accounts I've ever experienced.
Hold on one second. This is played in the middle. Try it again.
Looking for a job anywhere. She was an undocumented migrant from Mexico, just out of an abusive marriage with a family to support. Her manager, Zachary Bias, hired various members across Sandra's family, knowing they were undocumented, Perez says. Several weeks after starting work, Perez says the unthinkable happened in the walk-in cooler.
He forced me. He took me to the walk-in and he forced me. And it was, my body, my mind first, because it was supposed to happen on my job.
Perez is now alleging in a federal lawsuit that the rape continued weekly, totaling over 20 times, despite her saying no and trying to fight. In court filings, Sabias admits to having sex with her in the cooler, but maintains the relationship was consensual. But her allegations are not uncommon.
Ms. Perez's case is among the most horrific stories, the most horrific accounts I've ever experienced. I've worked for more than 2 decades with immigrant communities, victims of hate violence, domestic violence, and this is just such a horrific case of what she has gone through in the workplace.
Immigration law expert Greg Chin says there's no real way to know how many migrants often don't report harassment in jobs they cannot leave.
If people like her are targeted because they are afraid that they'll lose immigration status, or in her case, that they'll be deported because she doesn't have status, that is not good for the country. And that's why Congress should really act and legalize immigrants and provide legal status for them.
Sandra says it was at a Sbarro inside this building, but used to be the Monte Carlo resort where the weekly assaults happened.
Threatening with deport me. You want me to call immigration? You start walking.
Her lawsuit said the attacks continued for 5 months before she was transferred to another Sbarro location.
Did you feel you had any other choice?
Yes, I feel like I don't have no choice. Not even when they say I have a choice. No, when you are illegal. No, when you are illegal, you don't have a choice.
3 months after Perez was transferred, she filed a complaint against Sabias with Sbarro, the Nevada Equal Rights Commission, and the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The commission found probable cause to support Perez's charge of sex discrimination and harassment and provided their report to the court. Sabias's lawyer says the police have yet to contact his client.
Even how much I believe in the law, it is hard because, we don't even know what is going to happen. We don't even know if he's going to jail.
Years later, Perez obtained a green card through marriage, allowing her to legally live and work inside the United States. And she says that with no fear of being deported, she decided to sue both Sabias and Sbarro for $178 million, arguing the company mishandled her claims. Lawyers for Sbarro argued Perez failed to take advantage of the company's complaint procedure and that when she did come forward, they acted seriously, quickly, and promptly to investigate her claims. In a statement, Sbarro denies her claims about the company's handling of her allegations. They said Perez, quote, refused to cooperate with the investigation. Instead, she pursued legal action, which has persisted over the past several years.
Sandra, like a lot of undocumented people out there, think they have no recourse, that no one's going to listen to them. She was told over and over that no one was going to believe her.
Dee Sull and Jenny Foley are representing Perez in court, a trial that began in Las Vegas last week.
When she first saw Zachary in the courtroom, she turned around to get out of the courtroom and she sat down on a bench outside where she was sobbing emphatically.
Outside of court, Perez says she is trying to get back on her feet. She since has a new job in a new restaurant. A fresh opportunity still filled with old triggers.
What would you tell other women, undocumented women, who find themselves in that same position?
To say something, to don't be scared. It is hard because I never thought it was
And Julia Ainsley joins us now from Washington. Julia, the allegations in this piece.
Okay, we'll stop there and add my friend Dee Sull, who was so courageous and so amazing that you take on these cases. But before we get into that, I'd just like to kind of tell people more about you. Your own history is very, very interesting, with your parents immigrating from India to Canada, and the way you sort of were reared based on some of those issues that was happening, with the Sikhs and their torture and murdering and all the things that they did, and some of your family were victims of some of that. But just tell us a little bit about your history and how you came really to be this ally for people who don't have a voice.
Well, thank you, Kennedy. I want to say first off, thank you for having me here. And the work that you're doing is amazing, I think, for the community and just organizations in general. I think I'm very fortunate. I had great parents, who reared me into being a very productive and involved citizen of not only my community, but a citizen of the world. Very early on, certain things, I think when you grow up, you have memories of certain things that were very impactful. And for me, I remember certain things in my lifetime where there was an instance where a young schoolgirl was being bullied and ran up to our lawn, because the high school was just up the street, by the way. And it was really profound to see certain things like that, where my mom, this poor girl, was bullied by about 30 girls, and I guess, it was kind of an interesting thing. She ran up to our front door and rang the doorbell for help. And we looked out the window, and my mom went out and spoke to these girls, and said, you're going to have to go, and I'm going to be reporting you guys, to the school principal for this action. And she did do that. For that girl, I'm sure she found cover, but at the same time, that was such a profound example, because my, mom really stood up for this young girl, and then did take her down to the school principal and made that report. And I know, from what I understand, because I was attending that high school, my mother, I know that they were disciplined for that. And I think that was, one of many examples. I come from very humble beginnings. My parents have a farm, and they were blue collar workers. Luckily, unionized as well. Workers' rights were important, I think, in our household. We did, I think that, with that, we had a gift where, they were able to send their children to school. And I don't think that, we very often kind of sit there and really appreciate that not everyone really can afford to go to school. Even now, I know that is a struggle. But with that, there came a lot of privilege. If we think about anyone who is able to graduate out of high school and then go to college, there is a certain privilege. And then you still think that things are going to be equal along the way. But often they aren't, in our own experiences. And I'm sure, Kennedy, even with you, I'm sure you've faced adversity, when I came into Las Vegas. I faced adversity as well, as a woman of color, and I was an educated woman of color, and breaking into, what I would say a very tight knit legal community was very, very difficult in the early days. In fact, it was so difficult to find a job. The discrimination that would go on was very overt. In fact, I don't share it often, but putting my name as Hardeep on an application was very difficult. I wouldn't get a call back, but the minute I put D Kennedy, I started to receive callbacks. And so very little things like that, kind of like, start to shape you as a human being and how you want to stand up. And you mentioned, you know, I am of the Sikh faith, but my own uncle was also tortured by the Indian government during the Sikh riots. And so, all of that plays in. I have been very privileged, I feel like to have a voice, to be an ally, to advocate, and be there for our community and just make a better, like community for all of us. I'm imperfect, but with that said, I'm trying to do my best there, for our community as well, just like everyone. I think that those are life choices that we make, along the way.
No, I think that you're doing amazing. That it's interesting to hear you talk about certain things. One that we have in common. I also believe that things were. I thought honestly when I went to college, and that's when I got my rude awakening, that racism and all of that was a history lesson. I thought my dad told me about it. It was very little discussed in school. It's like, okay, well, that happened. That's horrible, but we're here. And I would say things like, it's 1998. Why is this happening? It's 2000X. Why is this happening? And unfortunately, time does not really improve. So we're not on this. I learned that we're not on this progression of just getting better, but that there is sort of a dual faction that's happening, that there's always this resistance that apparently will always be there. And so for every step you take, there's something or someone resisting that and trying to move you back. I am actually sad right now. I don't know if you've heard about the LA City Council, and they made some really racist remarks, and it came from people from the Hispanic community. And I've also grown up to believe that people of color, we're all in this thing together, just trying to get more economic democracy, more self-determination for all of us. And certainly Black leaders always say things like Black and brown, blah, blah, blah. But apparently that is not the intent of everyone. And so I really do get disappointed when I hear how people are thinking of things in the past, and why I also get so excited when I hear someone like you who your whole profession is based on really helping people who are marginalized, demonized, criminalized, and all of those things, and just simply want a good job and to provide for their children as our parents wanted to provide for us. So, well, let's talk a little bit about your client, and to the extent that you're able. I know that the case is potentially ongoing, and so with that, my heart really went out to her because she really felt she had no one else. And you even mentioned in the bully story that your mom did something and said something, sort of like the airport thing. If you see something, say something, when bullying is happening. But I will say that when there is an injustice that happens, what really pains people the most is the amount of people who witnessed it and did nothing. Were there people around Ms. Perez that could have come to her aid or spoke up? And did that happen? I haven't heard anything around that. So if you're able to share that, I'd be interested.
Yeah, I mean, there were people there. As a general manager, in any scenario, you have a great amount and the ability to control someone's schedule. And certain things were happening with very controlled settings, I will say. People that had maybe knowledge weren't going to do anything. And it certainly, wasn't, it appears definitely there was admission of more than one person, by the way. And that, I mean, and I would probably sit there and say, well, if there was more than one person, obviously there are a lot of women that, probably just couldn't find the courage to step up. So there were individuals. There were initially 3 defendants, and one did not show up, or we weren't able to serve him. The second one was dismissed out of the lawsuit, and of course the general manager did stand, through the civil trial. So there were, and they were predominantly the people there. Was also, what was very disturbing was the behavior was endorsed, or accepted. It seemed to be common knowledge that we had somebody where people knew about it and no one said anything about it early enough, which says a lot about a corporate culture and how far someone is permitted to take liberties. And so control wasn't, arguably, I think, always there.
Yeah, I just want to say, if you're listening, if you see something, say something. That is so difficult for someone to be abused and isolated. And I know that everyone needs their job like everyone else does. Do it anonymously, write a letter. I don't care what you do, but try to be a person who at least can verify what they say is happening at the very minimum. And I just know that there's so much fear around that. And I've had situations where people of no power and of lots of power still did nothing. Still said nothing. And especially with the people with power, I don't know what you were actually afraid of, but it is not okay to, I don't know, it's just not me. And I just figure that I don't know how other people do it. I just could not stand by and watch someone suffer, be abused, and absolutely not do anything. In fact, I would risk what I have going on, because I do believe it's karma, and that somehow I'll be in another situation and no one will come to my aid. So thinking of the employer, though, so hiring undocumented workers is a crime. To what extent of punishment do U.S. corporate employers, what are they likely to get in this case? In not this case, but all cases.
So, well, everybody files what we call an I-9, out there. So every worker in the United States should be doing that. If you're not, somebody is not following the right protocol there, especially if you're an employee of the company. It's a little bit different for independent contractors, just so you know, Kennedy. And so everybody has a duty to do that. It is at that juncture that you actually present proper identification, including social security numbers, of whether or not you're permitted to work in the United States. The manager is supposed to be verifying that. Really nice. Sorry, I have a little interference here on the end, so I apologize. But what I would sit there and say is, if the document doesn't look authentic, which often is the case, I would sit there and say, if it doesn't snuff out that test, I think you're probably in the right to say no to the worker at that point. You have a duty to inspect the authenticity.
And so if they're hiring people and say, I'll pay you cash under the table, because they absolutely know that this person is undocumented and they're not trying to pass themselves off as such, but the employer realizes that this status will allow them to pay them, a sub minimum wage. What legally happens to an employer who willfully hires undocumented workers for the purpose of exploitation?
Well, so there is something called the Office of Discrimination out there, just so you know. And a worker can make a complaint there. First off, you're not supposed to have undocumented workers there. Let's be quite frank about that. But in the event that it, does happen and some of the egregiousness starts to happen, they also have rights here. And so Sandra did have rights, that she was a protected person at that point. Title VII affords everybody rights, by the way, Kennedy. It doesn't matter about your status. And it's been longstanding, and it is a savior over there. Often we kind of like forget certain things out there. I'll give you an example that is more forgotten, but it is always there, which is farms, right? We have individuals who are out there and they will sit there and make, they'll go pick for the harvest, prune, and all that. I can probably say a good part of those individuals, they're probably undocumented. And you may be surprised to say, well, why hasn't anyone done anything about this? Most immigration attorneys and advocates and allies, we've been asking for legalization. And I think in your clip, by the way, just so you know, Mr. Chen was going to allude that, I mean, we know about the problem. And so we know that abuses do happen out there. I think in a 2017 study by the American Immigration Council, I think they were saying 5% of the labor force was undocumented. Those are pretty big numbers if you start thinking it. And that's 2017. I don't know, a current number to give you a statistic. But to quantify that, I always sit there and say, we're all workers, regardless of their status. They have rights in the United States. And that's the beauty of America. That's why I love this country so much.
Exactly. So is there a fine for employers who break the law or jail time? What happens?
So let's say that the ICE actually shows up at your doorstep and says, I want to review your I-9s. They have that right to do that with the proper protocols. And for every mismatch of the social security number or something where the documentation is questionable, there can be up to a $10,000 fine per person, just so you know. And we've done audits for some of our clients where we're very labor intensive and certain jobs are very, very risky out there. And undocumented workers tend to actually, I would say, apply for them because no one will take those jobs. And someone may give a tip to the, ICE, and then they go in and they do an I-9 verification. And sometimes I have to have what I call the quote unquote coming to Jesus talk with the, the client who happens to be the corporation. And I'd say, if you really care about your workforce and you care about your employees, then you need to let them know. It says that you're, not only do you have to let them go, but ICE has your address now, because that's what happens in an I-9 scenario. 1 in 5 people in the state of Nevada have mixed status families. And when I say mixed status families, that is also a mix of US citizen born maybe children, or maybe one of the spouses US citizen and one person is undocumented in that family. Those are big statistics. That's our makeup of our community these days.
So I know that the ICE activity of the last administration has calmed down significantly. Can you tell us a little bit more about, what happened then and where we are today regarding the aggression that people are taking with deportation?
Well, under Biden, there are certain protocols right now. A person like Sandra isn't an enforcement priority. But given, what happened, I mean, her status was won during the Trump years, and that was a very difficult task. So it was more difficult back in those days. Our burdens are higher, and there were a lot of doors slamming on an immigration attorney back then. But now I feel like unless you have a very hardened criminal, past, you've got a better chance of maybe remaining in the United States. Not because it's easier. You may be able to do what we call prosecutorial discretion. Um, and it's just an easier environment to actually report bad behavior right now. It wasn't back even when Sandra did it. It was horrible back then because you were wondering what the feds were going to do, and you're always putting yourself out. And because deportation was used as a card against her to elicit that type and reward that behavior, it became, very, very problematic. And that is, one of these things I always say to people, be very, very careful, of being a target, of something, especially on your status. And it still exists even nowadays, just so you know, Kennedy. Maybe not to that pervasiveness. Sandra was, that is the most extreme case we've ever handled at the moment.
So I had, here it is. So I just brought up, I had the definitions of the UNT visa, and if you could, so when Dee was describing that, one of the things he used in the trial was that she was using the crime of rape, sexual abuse as a method to get the U visa, and the U non-immigrant status U visa is set aside for victims of crime who have suffered physical or mental abuse. And there is about 30 crimes listed plus others that if you are suffering as you do not have immigrant status here, that you are considered a victim of crime and perhaps can get a U visa. In that clip that we did not show, they also mentioned a T non-immigrant status, which is a temporary immigration benefit that enables certain victims of severe form of trafficking. And so they were trying to allege that she was only using that as a way to get her immigrant status. And so do you think that had anything to do with the outcome?
Indeed, it probably did. That was a big part of it, I think. One of the problems with this whole UNT theories that they used, they misrepresented to the jurors exactly what was used. And immigration was used as this big smoke screen. I know it's become very politicized, and that's problematic. But what really hurts was that they were officers of the court, propagating this and perpetuating this theory that was false. In fact, we never used it. Very early on in the case, did she have it available? Absolutely, she had it available, Kennedy. But when someone is going to go low and you're anticipating that, we don't use it. And I didn't use it on purpose because this was what was going to happen. Unfortunately, they still ran with it, but it was amazing to see just how litigious and volatile those feelings, perhaps against an undocumented, at one point, an undocumented worker was.
Mm.
That's, their duty was to be honest, and I feel like they skewed things along the way with jurors. And there's not much we can do about it, at this point, because it's been said and it was decided by the jury. And so, but justice, like I say, is always slow. It doesn't mean it's the end yet, either, Kennedy. I feel that, I believe in the system, even though it can be very challenging. Otherwise, what's the point of us doing the jobs that we all do, including yourself? We believe in good change out there, I think, and good people, and that's what I hope that people who are listening to this, are able to implement good protocols and safe working conditions for all workers at the end of the day. The environment, that is the baseline duty for every worker who goes to work, not to have as a hostile work, environment.
right? You use the term hope, and even former President Obama, the book really had the title Audacity of Hope. How can we hope in the face of the things that we're seeing? But there's nothing to do if you can't, right? Like, if you don't actually believe that there is a better tomorrow, that there are good people who are going to step up at some point, then, you know, it's a pretty dismal job. But I do hope, in so many ways, but the workplace specifically, for me, is the worst place people can attack people, because it has so many other uh, detractors that can ruin you, right? And so you lose your job, you can lose your place to live, you can't feed your kids. Like, so many things happen, and that's why the workplace is uh, an insidious place to be abused and allow people to do that to you. And so she mentioned later in the clip how she has triggers even, today. And so it's something that will always be there. And for someone to believe that she went through all of that just to get a visa, or some other common reason, is insane. That we as women have time for that. Like, we don't have time to do the things we need to do, let alone the time to actually cook up something, just because we don't have, just because it's fun. So I really hope that Ms. Perez can get some healing. Was there any opportunity for her to get some mental health counseling as a result? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, she's been fortunate. She has great providers now, a therapist that helps her. And I think this is unfortunately, something that she'll probably end up doing for the rest of her life, Kennedy. I can't sit there and think that this is not that she's going to be able to be healed in 10 years. I think there are good days and bad days, especially for the type of abuse that Sandra did actually suffer at the workplace. And a workplace where she was supposed to have the right to work in a safe environment. That was not a safe environment for her. And and probably, you know, we kind of sit there and think, what can we do, right? I mean, Kennedy, what an HR person really can do is make sure they have a policy in place, of whether or not a subordinate and a GM could have a relationship. A lot of things need to be formalized, for people. And the other thing is, it should be memorialized where every worker acknowledges that. And I think that these employee manuals, should be revised as time goes by. I mean, we've had COVID happen. I saw something very early on in this morning, which was an interesting thing that they said that. I mean, uh, there are serious behavior problems now since COVID. And how is that not going to be trickling into the workplace, right? I mean, these are things that, HR professionals and individuals who are leading organizations must think about, and how to keep a safe work environment, in there, and how that will affect your workforce and your bottom line, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I think if you have a happy, healthy workplace, uh, I believe the money always follows. I mean, that's really the ultimate thing, and you have loyalty as well, and a buy-in into your mission. So, I mean, those are things I think, and I think sexual harassment itself has to be, I think, whether we acknowledge it or not, it should be, a couple of times, at least a minimum of once a year for all employees in a company to be reintroduced, along the way of what's permitted. You said something really profound to me. As women, we also are very dismissive of certain things. I mean, we'll ignore it. You know what I mean? Um, we'll just say it's part of the territory, or okay, I got to put up with it. Well, technically, you don't have to put up with, harassing comments, or the way someone makes a comment on maybe your hair, right? I mean, or the way you look, maybe you're not as pretty, or that woman may have a certain derriere, right? I mean, those things are not really cute and should not be condoned in a workplace. But Kennedy, unfortunately, I think a lot of people do put up with that.
Definitely. Definitely. I remember when the Me Too movement happened on social media. I didn't know what it was. I just saw it in everyone's bio. And I was just like, oh my gosh, all these people have dealt with that. And it took me 2 years to realize I had too, but I had brushed it so far under that it didn't occur to me. And so we certainly live lives that show that we put up with so much and then really just do it. There's a quote that I that I said for all women: the ongoing persistence of sexual harassment and the subtle but pervasive doubts about competence, intelligence, and skill that's unrelated to actual performance is exhausting, unfair, and economically oppressive. It is. It's just, and it doesn't matter what type of job I'm talking about, from high income paying jobs, high skilled jobs, from doctors to lawyers, to secretaries, to teachers, to therapists and caseworkers, and on the way down. Down to domestic workers, which is DOL's lowest job category. But it does not matter. As women, there are so many things that we have. And as we talked about that identity, those dimensions of identity, and you start adding on person of color, poverty, a certain religion, a certain name that you mentioned when you were applying, that is well documented evidence that if you have an ethnic sounding name, you will get more than half less the callbacks as as Amy or Brad will. And it's a fog that we're all living under, but I really do hope that we can come to a point where, in the spaces that we occupy, I think I am humble enough to understand that I will not change the world. It will continue on as it is. But in the spaces that I'm able to influence and occupy, the companies that I'm in, that somehow this little corner of the world can be different. And if I can do that, that would make me extremely happy. And I see that you are doing it for the corners of the world that you are impacting as well. And so, any last words for victims, corporations, potential victims? What can you tell us?
So I think for victims, like you said, say something. If someone sees it, it needs to be reported. It's not okay. For employers, there's so much you can do to facilitate a safe work environment that you don't need to let things get to a point where it becomes this debacle, as in this particular case I felt. I mean, you can do simple things and do team building things. You need to know who your people are, who are representing you, who are advocating and being your ally, even in an organization. And if you have no control over, these people, that's a problem. One of the simple things I think that, especially like, let's say service industry jobs, Kennedy, just doing what I call theft audits are a really simple way of kind of figuring out where the corporation is. And the reason why I said theft audits is because usually there's other behaviors that are going on in the back. And so if it's really a high amount of theft audits that are going, a lot of product is missing or money is missing, then really, quite honestly, there are other things going on in that organization that you may not know about. And so I feel like those are things that employers can do, and really show up, be there, what I mean, for employees I understand that you are representing your corporation, but really, with that said, don't you want to be known as the corporation that takes care of your employees? Because the bottom line is with your employees, happy workplace is going to translate to dollars in the end. And there's no reason that you can't have it all, Kennedy, in the end.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dee, for hopping on today and being such a great guest. I really appreciate you. I miss you. I hope to see you, or at least, throughout the end of the year and the holidays at all of these galas or whatever's happening. But thank you again for doing this. And if there's anything I can do, if you need a lawyer, please do call Dee Sull. She is, the person who really can get you through on a variety of levels. You're extremely even loving in the way you talk. So I know that your clients must really, really, really appreciate all the things that you bring to a case. So please let me know if I can do anything for you. And if there's anything, if you are a victim of sexual assault, or sexual crime, or any crime for that matter, please do say something, report it. I do believe that suffering in silence is not the way to do it. And I want you to be safe. And I know that a lot's at stake when it comes to your job, but you can lose you in the process if you continue to allow, someone to abuse you over a long period of time. So consider that you are the gift in this situation, and that will make a place for you and another place that can appreciate who you are and what you bring to the table. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon.